Hello and welcome to this video on the marginal productivity theory of labour. So in this video we're going to look at describing the marginal productivity theory of the demand for labour. So this is really the theory that underpins the downward sloping demand curve that we have for labour in the labour market. So we've established already that labour has a derived demand. The demand for labour really comes from the demand for the goods which the labour is used to produce. So here is a good example. We can see the market for takeaway coffee, and as the demand for takeaway coffee has risen, then we need more baristas to serve the coffee, so the demand for baristas would also increase, resulting in an increase in the wage rate and number of baristas employed. So the demand for labour is in part linked to the demand for the products the labour goes into making. Now, why the demand curve is downward sloping is due to the marginal revenue product theory. So let's have a look at some key terms first of all, and then we'll go through some examples. So this theory suggests that demand for labour depends on the marginal revenue product of a worker versus the wage firms are willing to pay. Another way to think about the marginal revenue product is how much extra revenue does each worker bring in. So the marginal revenue product is the extra revenue a firm gains from employing an extra worker. And this depends on how much the workers produce, their productivity, and also how much their output is sold for, which is the marginal revenue or the price. So we need to know about the productivity, the marginal physical product. How many extra units does an extra worker produce? And then we can multiply that by the marginal revenue, the extra revenue that producing that extra unit generates. So the marginal revenue product equals the marginal physical product multiplied by the marginal revenue, i.e. quantity times the value. So let's have a look here at a numerical example to make things clearer. So on the left-hand side, if we imagine for a business, this is the number of units of labour that they might employ. So 1 worker, 2 workers, 3 workers, 4 workers. And then this is the total output that those workers produce each week. So if we have 1 worker, we produce 10 units. If we have 2 workers, we produce 24. If we have 3 workers, 44, and so on. So here we can see the marginal physical product. How many additional items? What is the additional output that each worker brings? Well, by adding 1 worker, we get an extra 10. By adding the second worker, we go from 10 to 24, so we add 14. By adding the third worker, we now add 20 units, 24 to 44. So we can see increasing returns here. By the time we get down to this level here, we can see that returns actually from the extra workers are starting to decrease. If we assume here that we're operating in a perfectly competitive market, so that the price, average revenue, equals the marginal revenue, then for every extra output, unit of output we get, we're getting an extra $20. That's the price for these additional levels of output. Then at the far right-hand column, we can calculate the marginal revenue product of labour. What is the additional revenue I'm getting from adding these extra workers? So by adding the first worker, I get an additional $200. By adding the second worker, I get an additional $280, the extra 14 units at a price of $20. By adding the third worker, I get 20 more units at a price of $20 each. So the marginal revenue product of the third labour is $400. So what we can see is we have diminishing returns to extra labour. We've looked at this previously when we've looked at productivity, but we can see that as we keep adding workers, in the short run we end up getting diminishing returns to labour. And what that does, it means that the marginal revenue product of labour starts to decrease over time. Now, what we're assuming here is that firms are profit maximizers. So they will choose a level of employment, they will choose a level of workers at which they can maximize profit. So if we assume here that the workers are paid $160 each per day, this is the marginal cost of labour, how many workers would it make economic sense for this firm to employ? Well, we compare the marginal revenue product of labour, how much revenue the workers are bringing in, to the cost of employing them $160. So the first worker, 200 they bring in, and it costs 160 to employ them. So yes, worker number 1, you're in. Number 2 brings in an extra 280 and we'd have to pay them 160. So yes, they're in. We keep going until we get to the sixth worker. The sixth worker brings in $160 extra revenue, and it costs them $160 a day to employ them. So we would employ up to the point of 6 workers. So at this wage rate, $160, the firm should employ 6 workers. So the theory goes that a profit maximizing firm should employ workers up until the point where the marginal revenue product of labour, whilst it's diminishing, decreasing, equals the marginal cost of labour. So in this case, when 6 people are employed, we reach that point. Employing the 7th person will actually lead to a fall in total profits because the extra revenue they bring in, $80, is less than the extra cost of employing them because of the diminishing returns. If we look at this graphically, we can see that here is the increasing returns, increasing marginal revenue product of labour. Then we get diminishing returns set in once we go beyond the 3rd worker. And we compare that here to the blue line, which is the marginal cost, what we have to pay them in terms of wages. And so we can say it makes economic sense. The revenue, marginal revenue product of labour is greater than the cost up until the 6th worker, but we would not employ the 7th worker. So how can we link this to the labour demand curve? Well, the labour demand curve here is downward sloping. So as wages fall, then employment increases. We would look to hire more workers. So let's see how that corresponds to this diagram we've established on the left-hand side. So if the wage rate is $160, it makes sense to employ 6 workers. Let's imagine for a second that actually the wage rate was increased to, let's say, $240. So if we imagine now the wage rate was up here at $240, what would be the impact using our logical theory here? Well, the impact would be that actually it would only make sense now to employ 5 workers rather than 6 workers if the wages were higher. So if you translate that over here, if the wages were higher at W2, say $240, actually we're going to employ less people. So we get this contraction in demand for labour as wages rise. If we imagine a slightly different scenario, perhaps, imagine wages fell to, let's say, around $70 down here, around $70, what would be the impact of that? Well, if wages were to fall, actually it would make economic sense to now employ the 6th worker and up to the 7th worker as well. All these workers here, the marginal revenue product of labour would be greater than the cost, so actually it would make economic sense to employ them. So if the wage rate was to fall from W1 to W3 down to $70, let's say, we would see an expansion in the demand for labour. So as a general theory, this idea of looking at the marginal revenue product, how much extra revenue does the extra workers bring in, comparing it to the wages that we're currently paying. If the wage rate was to rise, then we would demand fewer workers. If the wage rate was to fall, then the business would demand more workers. So this gives us our slope for the labour demand curve. Finally, in evaluating this theory, what can we note? So some problems with this theory. It's quite difficult to measure the efficiency of our workers. Measuring productivity can be quite difficult. In the construction industry, it might be quite straightforward. We can say, okay, you've assembled this many walls, or you've made this contribution to a building. In call centers, we can maybe monitor how many calls people get through per hour. But in certain things like maybe education, how do you monitor the marginal revenue product of a teacher? How do you monitor the marginal revenue product of a consultant, perhaps? It can be hard in some instances for firms to get a grasp of how much extra revenue that one worker is bringing in to then compare it to the wage rate. Again, industries where there's lots of collaborative work, people work together, it's hard to then assign a certain level of marginal revenue to an individual worker when it's a team effort, and how do we attribute the contributions of the team or the output of the team to one individual. And lastly, many people have the ability to set their own pay, so they're not going to be following what the market kind of would be suggesting, and they're not going to necessarily be paying themselves in line with what their marginal revenue product is. So there might be a kind of a breakdown here between the contribution they're making to the business in terms of extra revenue and the pay that they are determined by the business. So in this video, we've looked at the marginal productivity theory of the demand for labour, and this gives us our downward sloping demand curve plus a few evaluation points at the end. That's it. Thanks very much for listening.